As has been discussed, I have promised to do this in English, and we will stick to that whether there are English speakers in the audience or not, for the sake of the recording and various other things. So what I want to talk about here today is primarily to discuss this project that we are involved with, which is called FLIP, which is an anagram for Flipped Learning in Praxis. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to present a bit sort of the research component of this project, but being aware of the nature of this conference, I want to try to sort of put it into a context that I think will maybe cater to more of the audience than a purely academic educational exercise. So I'm going to tell you about the project itself, what the aims of the project are and who is involved. We'll talk about what we mean by flipped learning, what this flipping entails, and what it is that we're actually striving to get out of this. I'll describe the research component, and then I'm going to try to have a little bit of a takeaway for maybe the information technology, those people who are actually interested in getting in on that sort of market, and what sort of information we might have for those people. Now, just to clarify, one thing that I do not have in my slides is to explain what we mean when we talk about learning technology. That essentially any technology that facilitates flows of information is, in essence, a learning technology, because it's in those information flows that learning occurs. A pencil is a learning technology. It's questionable whether a chair in a classroom is a learning technology specifically, but it's certainly a technology. But then we have technologies that are really strategically oriented to facilitate learning, right? Those are the technologies that are created for use in learning environments and intended to maximize or produce some sort of learning outcomes. We take a broad view of technology, and so when we talk about technology, and I will be talking a lot about technology, it's really essential to this modern concept of flipped learning that I may be talking about strategic learning technologies, and I may be talking about incidental learning technologies. And an example of an incidental learning technology is just, for instance, a messaging app. That this is something that learners or any individual is using to transfer information from one person to another, and some sort of learning occurs within that process. It may be relevant to what the person is learning in their formal learning environment or not, but there's some sort of learning that goes on there, and that creates opportunities for us who work in education. And we need to sort of seek those out and think of ways that we can make use of them. Now, so about the project, like I say, the name of the project is Flipped Learning in Praxis, or FLIP. This is an international project funded by the Erasmus Plus program. It's a 2-year project, which is rather brief, but we decided to be very ambitious and try to get a lot done in a short amount of time, rather than dragging it on for 3 years and then seeing where we go at the end of the 2 years. But the overall aim, so what we're looking to get out of this, is a set of guidelines that we can hand over to teachers that say, yeah, I'm interested in this flipped learning concept. What do I do? How do I do this? So we want to get a bunch of guidelines and say, here is the manual to flipping learning. Maybe not the concise manual, but at least enough instructions to get you on your way. So that's the overall goal. We have, I think we could say that we have a very strong partnership. And it's a sort of fairly equal blend of private sector, public sector, academia, You can tell from the list, maybe not some of the foreign partners. There are Giunti Scuola. This is the largest producer of textbooks in Italy, I think. So we have Miska, they are in Slovenia. They are involved in teaching training. It's a private company. And so this is a very, very broad partnership that I think gives a lot of value to the project. And we hope that that will help us to actually see things from various perspectives. So, getting into sort of what it is that we actually plan to do. So we've got what we're going to get out of it, but how we're going to go about producing that. That first is understanding what we mean by flipping learning in praxis. That we are going to be working with practicing educators, school teachers, people involved in adult education, vocational education. Like I say, it's a broad partnership. And working with them to examine how they go about implementing flipped learning in an effective manner. And it's sort of a cyclical process that we're looking at, that where there will be implementation, there will be reflection, which will feed back into the implementation process to refine and try to understand what it is that works, what really gets us to the point that we want to be, and what does not. That I think one of the strengths of this project for us is that we have this research component in it. This doesn't happen all that often in, at least not Erasmus programs of this nature. So we have a very strong research component. I'm going to describe more later what that really involves. What it is that we're actually sort of mostly looking at is really what it is the instructors, what it is that a teacher who is implementing flipped learning needs to know. What sort of skills do they need to have? What do they need to understand about classroom dynamics, pedagogy, didactics? Because flipped learning, when we talk about flipped learning, we have a specific definition in mind, which I'm going to cover a little later. One thing about this research component in particular goes to the last point here, that we are looking at, so we're working with schools in a number of European countries, and that can cause various difficulties. Because one of the things that we want to do is to be able to take a broad view and see what's happening in all of these countries that are involved, and to be able to make some sort of generalizations from that. To be able to say, okay, you, sort of at the end of this, you are working in a Greek school. You weren't involved in the project, so we don't really know what goes on in Greece, but we have some general ideas of things that work across contexts. Now, this is something that is very difficult to do, but we've had to sort of figure it into the way that we define the research project, and I'll describe that sort of in a while. So, what do we mean by flipped learning? The terminology on this is a bit hazy at the moment, to say the least. People talk about flipped teaching, flipped learning. Of course, here in Iceland, we have a flippa, spekla, venta, ventikensla, ventinám. One can wonder, is everyone talking about the same thing when they're using all of these different terms? It's hard to tell. I think that because this is a relatively novel concept, and when these sort of concepts arise, you get sort of a bandwagon effect. And people love to say, oh, flipped learning, yes, I've been doing that for years. And so they sort of appropriate the concept, and then you say, well, no, that's not what I meant, so let's redefine it. And we're at that stage where we have a lot of redefinitions, but we're trying to narrow it back down to really focus on what it is that we mean. And I think that the consensus is that when we're talking about flipping, whatever terminology we use, that our primary interest is in the learning process, that we are trying to change how we affect learning. And so what that means is that we're turning something on its head with the purpose of creating flexibility to be able to address learners' needs in new ways. Okay? And so the focus really becomes not on what we do in that flipped instance, but more what we do with the flexibility that we hope it ensues. Okay? So basically, I think that there's been a lot of attention, especially on the use of video recorded lectures for flipping learning. Okay? And very often when you say flipped learning, people just saying, oh yeah, recording your lectures so kids can watch those at home. And that's a part of it. And that's really sort of gets at an essential part of it, that the flipping really concerns taking the direct instruction, that is that traditional stereotypical role of the teacher that people tend to have, that the teacher is sort of doing the teaching thing. It's unidirectional, that you take that out of the learning environment because that's not effective for learning. So that can involve recording a teacher's lecture and making that video available online. Students watch the video outside of the classroom time. That becomes the homework, so to speak. And then you have all of this time and space to do something new with the students. Now the question with flipped learning is really, what are you going to do with that time that you've created to work with students in a face-to-face environment? So that's sort of the gist of what we mean by flipped learning. It's really focusing on creating opportunities to do something very different in the time that you're actually face-to-face with students. Okay? Now, why do people flip? That's sort of the big question. There have been a lot of reasons given. I would say that there's not really a lot of good research that has been done on flipping. For one thing, it's still a very novel concept. Another thing is that much of the research that we do find is very incremental, small sample sizes, very strong potential for bias. It's teachers studying their own classroom, that sort of thing. And so we take this with a grain of salt, to say. But these are the various things that people say flipped learning accomplishes. Okay? Perhaps one of the most important for us, or the two most important for us, are the first two. That this is really sort of how we frame our approach to the flipped learning. When we get down to that final point, that flipped learning raises student achievement, there we're getting on slippery ground. It's very hard to make those sorts of associations that a new practice actually raises achievement, but there have been claims to that effect. We'll see how that works. Now, also in our mind, that the rationale for flipping, why we flip, is that it is a way to integrate technology in learning, which is something that we have to get much better at doing, right? That very much in many learning environments, yet to this day, information technology is something that is tacked on to existing practice. And I know that Ragnar Thayer, he will tell you, and has told you already in many of his writings, that a lot of implementations of technology in schools here in Iceland and elsewhere involve doing the old stuff with new technologies. right? And that's not a very, very good integration of technology, because technology allows us to do new stuff, to do different things. There are so many possibilities out there that aren't being used. And so flipping is seen as a way of promoting creative uses of technology and various other things. Now, this the research component of the project, we don't really have very rigorous research-based frameworks to work from. Now, by that I mean that a framework basically tells you, if you do this, then you can expect this to happen, and this will happen, and this will happen. And we don't really have that with flipped learning yet. So what we're working with is a framework which has been described by an organization called the Flipped Learning Network. And they have described what they call the 4 pillars of flipped learning. And these are essentially, these 4 pillars, these are essentially what they describe what you expect or want to get out of flipping. And I think one of the things that might raise some interest, after all I've said, is that there's nothing about technology in these pillars. And we certainly can question, well, if flipped learning is as we have described, is technology actually necessary? Can you flip learning without technology? I would say that that's very questionable, because technology allows us to do so many interesting things that you just can't do without them. And certainly, you know, we can get into the possibilities of 3D printers, social media in learning, and various other things, that there are various things that we just can't do without the technology that we have available today. And I think it's essential to flipped learning. But the reason that it's not in any of these pillars and doesn't enter into this framework is because it's so thoroughly integrated as an idea, right? That you wonder in a modern environment how you would actually go about doing all of this stuff without modern information technologies. And I think you would be hard-pressed to accomplish these. Now, like I've mentioned, the first point is perhaps one of the most important, that the flexible environment. This is really the overall goal. It's like I say, we use technology in strategic and meaningful ways to create this flexibility. And then that flexibility becomes, you know, it becomes up to the teacher how they use it. It can be to facilitate direct one-to-one instruction, project-based learning. There's no one that says that this learning environment is confined to the classroom, right? So you don't necessarily need to be in the classroom. It's just an overall flexibility, and it's up to the teacher, the instructor, to really get creative about what you're going to do with this time that you have with the student. And that really puts a lot of pressure, I think, on educators. This is certainly one of the things that we will be addressing in the research project, because this is one of the things that comes up, that, you know, okay, I've recorded my lecture, it's on YouTube, the students are singing. What do I do with the students? Now that I've got a bunch of students sitting in front of me, what do I do? Right? That's the big question, really. So our research, I'm sort of going into explaining this research in a roundabout way. There are reasons for this, which I will get to at some point. So we are looking at using mixed methods, a range of methods for getting the data that we want to work with and to be able to get a good picture of, you know, what's happening within the schools that we're working with, where they are actually, you know, working on implementing flipped learning. But these research questions, we can look at these in two ways. Now, one is the traditional way from a research standpoint, that these are intended to guide our research, right? After we've conducted our research, we want to be able to formulate a response to these questions. But these questions are important for the teachers and instructors that we will be working with, because they are going to be actively involved in not just generating data, but gathering the data for us, right? We'll be using what's called an action research approach, which I'll describe in more detail here in a little while. So these are sort of expected to let the teachers that we're working with know what it is that we expect from them and what we want to get out of them. Okay. So one of the important things, one of the things that I really want to draw out in one of these questions is the second part, the second question, the design. That this is really sort of an important and essential component that we look at. So if you've created all this flexibility and you have an environment in which you have freedom to do all sorts of cool stuff with your learners, that it becomes, there's this question of what kind of environment are you going to create? And I think that becomes a design process. And calling it a design process, I think, puts it in a certain context, because when we talk about design, we design for specific purposes, right? We design to make things look good. We design to make things function well. So this design component is sort of important to the whole process. And this is what I mean, that we're trying to guide the teachers that we'll be working with. We're trying to guide their thinking to some extent with these questions, as much as guiding our own research. Sort of dry, traditional stuff when you're talking about research, what kinds of methods? Primarily, we'll be working with qualitative methods, which means we'll be getting data which is not numerical. We can't just add things up and figure out percentages, but it'll be textual. It'll be teachers describing what they did that day in their own words. And we have to parse through those texts and try to find certain types of trends. Now, I talked about the comparative component of the research, that we are conducting this research in 5 or 6 countries at the same time, all of which speak a different language. Now, doing comparative research with qualitative data is possible, but not in a 2-year time span. So even though this will be the brunt of the data that we're collecting, this will be most of the data. We'll have the teachers recording logs on their experiences and their practices, that this will not be very useful for the comparative component. For that, we need quantifiable data. We need to be able to simmer everything down to numbers and say that 1 in Slovenia is perfectly equal to 1 in Germany. And therefore, we have a meaningful comparison. And so the task for us was to come up with a way of doing this. And so what we're looking at, and we haven't quite sort of developed it enough to present it in detail, is what we're calling look-fors. And this is something that has been used in the implementation of the so-called Common Core education policy in the US. And basically, these are standardized concepts that describe the types of effects that you would hope to see from the implementation or the project that we're conducting, and practices that can easily be translated to all of the languages involved. And then you can ask the teacher, indicate numerically how important this was to your teaching today? How big a part of your practice today was this? And they indicate that with a number. As long as we can ensure that everyone understands the concept being used in the same way, then we have comparative data. Then we can say, well, this worked equally well in all of the countries. So maybe we can say to someone in Spain who wasn't involved in the project at all that we found that in a very general manner, this is an important component of flipping learning. And that's what we really want to be able to do. That's something that's very important to the project. How well that goes, well, you know, that remains to be seen. It's a tricky thing. So the research design, like I said, the important part of this is the action research component. And action research can be called, we can say that action research is really a process of praxis. It is involving the people who are actually affected by whatever it is you're trying to do, involving them in the research so that they record data, they reflect on the data, and they try to change their practice during the lifetime of the project in accordance with what the data says. Okay? And that's what action research is. It's basically developing practice through an iterative sort of record, analyze, change process. And that's the big part of this. And then, of course, is the comparative part. I think I'm going to jump over this one. And now, I think, especially in a research project like this, we're working with a hazy concept. We're working with a research design which puts great demands on the subjects of the research, and various other things that really make this a very tricky process. So there are certain limitations that we have to be very aware of to make sure that we actually, what we end up saying, that this is actually based on reliable evidence. There is perhaps one of the most important things is this balance. Like I said in the beginning, we're sort of in this, the concept of flipped learning is rather hazy, and still today you go and you mention flipping learning, flipping the classroom, flipping teaching to someone, and very often people will say that, yes, I've been doing that for years. Whereas under scrutiny, it turns out they probably really weren't. They might have directed their students to a video once or twice, but it's hard to really say that it's flipped learning. But there's this tendency to look for ourselves within the concepts that are thrown at us. Okay? And so that affects the qualitative research, and that affects especially the action research component. We have to be sure that the teachers that we're working with aren't doing that they're actually being a reliable generator and mediator of accurate data. One of the other things that's really problematic is, of course, the strong potential for bias. Okay? We, as researchers, are working directly with the subjects. We are engaged in the process of actually producing change. So, you know, we can easily get caught up in this. On the one hand, bias is, of course, it's a four-letter word, especially in academia. But maybe it's a good thing as well in this process, because we are not just trying to produce objective research. We are trying to produce change. And I think that we have to be sort of truthful to ourselves and say, well, you know, we have to believe in what we're doing as much as the teachers. If that comes down to qualifying as bias, then maybe bias, a little hint of bias is a good thing. So just The final thing, I'm just going to throw this slide up, but I'm not going to talk about it. I said that I might come up with some sort of takeaway, which I want to direct maybe more, maybe not at the educational community, but at the technology community, the people who are actually producing technology. And sort of learning technologies have become very popular because everyone knows it's a huge potential market. But a lot of the learning technologies that we see today are questionable at best. They are produced for various purposes which may or may not have anything to do with technology. Okay? I don't know how many times I've been asked to review apps that basically allow a teacher to give their students electronic badges because that's going to make them learn so much better. Research does not support that. I am being flashed with brilliant orange lights, so I'm going to end it there. I think we have time for questions, comments, and one of the things that I would be really interested to hear from you is what you people might want to get out of a project like this, because we're still developing our strategy in this, and there is certainly time and opportunity to change some of our focuses. Thank you.
Það komin hendi til loft, það með að vera á ensku og íslensku hvort þau viljið. Kannski kynna þér aðeins. MP from the Pirate Party in Iceland. What I would like to know is when will this project finish? So at what point would we be seeing this kind of manual? And with the question regarding the question what value would come out of this. One thing that Peter Tryggvi, father of modern management, has a lot talked about is about managing yourself. In a knowledge economy, you have to do that. One of the things you need to do, you need to know then is how you learn. And as he points out, it's very different. Some people learn best by reading, others by listening. Beethoven and Churchill, as he mentioned, they learn by writing. And if the teaching institution or the learning environment you're in does not facilitate that opportunity of you to learn in the way that you learn, in Peter Tryggvi's words, it damns you, that person, to frustration and hell. It's a hellish situation to be in. So that, I would say, is the greatest value that I would see out of this, as when you can have the lectures and all of that, both reading and listening material and like that available at your discretion. But in the classroom or the learning environment, when you have help and like that, that allows you for learning in your own way. Thank you.
Like I said, this is a 2-year project, and so that means not next fall, but the fall after that. That is when the project ends, but of course the guidelines should be available, before then, maybe a month or two. I don't think that we probably won't release any draft documents. It'll probably just be the final document. So it would be summer 2016. Yep. Yep. Regarding your other question, like I say, one of the purposes, one of the reasons that flipped learning is an attractive idea is because it gives you the flexibility to be able to offer differentiated learning opportunities with students when you actually meet with them. And a lot of people who have been flipping learning, that they'll allow the students to self-organize into groups in the face-to-face sessions where students are able to use their strengths to work with other students and facilitate group learning, while those who maybe are the weakest can work directly with the instructor. Or the instructor can come up with projects, tasks that are better suited to their needs. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Marta Kristín Lárusdóttir at Reykjavík University, teaching there in computer science, and we have been recording lectures for a long time.
That's that question of does this actually increase achievement? You know, and that's a really tricky question, and I'm not sure that we can measure that. Maybe not in the context of this project. The sort of theoretical thinking behind flipped learning has a concept of learning outcomes, which they define as mastery learning. With teachers that I've spoken with, that I've worked with, that have been flipping learning for quite some time, that's not a concern of theirs. They're sort of preoccupied with other things. But it's certainly something that we are looking at. One of the things that we're especially interested in looking at is how teachers who are flipping learning, how they assess learning outcomes. Maybe not what the actual learning outcomes are, but how are they assessing learning outcomes? And that's something that we actually have not found any research in the literature that is directly related to flipped learning about assessment methods. And so that's actually sort of one point that we're very interested in and are going to focus on specifically.
A little bit, because I understood the question slightly differently. I thought you were talking about the real-time feedback from students.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I had a response to that as well. There's nothing that says that you can't do something to try to ensure engagement or even gather some sort of evidence of engagement, even though that learning process is happening outside of the classroom. That, for instance, our Norwegian partner, that she told us that she regularly has students do some sort of assignment that at least demonstrates that they, went through the material that they were expected to and focused on it. That's the important thing, that it's not, just sitting in front of YouTube while chatting on Snapchat. Yeah, exactly. If anyone has any comments, any ideas relating to this project, want to follow up on it, that I am the project manager of Mentamedia at Mentavistasvið HÍ, and we have a website, mentamedia.is, and my contact information is there, and feel free to contact me whenever, about whatever. I like to talk. Tack.